60 has really picked up the pace, improving their time by 0.7 seconds. Let's see how this impacts the race. Sputnik NZ is currently leading the pack, followed by Newcombocken and Hot Wheels Skid 01 in third. It's a close race with plenty of opportunity for an upset. NB Racing is making moves, overtaking for cars to secure the 17th position. Newcombocken has surged to first place, surpassing Sputnik NZ. Hot 03 has advanced to 8th place, overtaking Jassax 72. Surianbot and Edelbrook are neck and neck for the 12th position, both showcasing their skills in a BMW M1 and a Porsche 911 RS 2.773 respectively. Meanwhile, Edelbrook is also fiercely competing against Gary Z for the 13th spot, where Gary Z is driving a Lamborghini Jarama S. Additionally, Gary Z and Noga 77 are in a tight tussle for the 14th position. Jassax 72 now in 8th place after overtaking Hot 03. Hot 03 and Popyoses are fighting for 9th place. Meanwhile, Popyoses and Zago 22 are battling it out for 10th place. Popyoses successfully overtakes Hot 03, securing 9th place with the Chevrolet Impala SS67. Meanwhile, Gary Z also made a move, advancing to 11th place by passing Zago 22 from Team Vanguard. Newcombocken and Sputnik NZ are in a battle for 1P. Newcombocken is driving a Chevrolet SS70 and Sputnik NZ is driving a Pontiac GTO 69. Gary Z has moved up to 10P, overtaking Hot 03. RC Terra Firma has moved up to 16P, overtaking NB Racing. Kamikaze 38 has advanced to 3P, surpassing Hot Wheels Skid 01. Gary Z has climbed to 8P, overtaking Jassax 72. It's a tight duel for 8P between Gary Z in a Lamborghini Jarama S and Jassax 72 in a Ford Falcon XV GT72. Zago 22 is now in 10th place, passing Popyoses. Popyoses and Noga 77 are contending for the 11th position. Meanwhile, RC Terra Firma has advanced to 14th, overtaking Rizaldi Adhar. Twix 560 has made an impressive move, snagging 5P from Deplorablica. The Ford Falcon XB GT72 of Jassax 72 and Lamborghini Jarama S of Gary Z are locked in a close fight for 8P. Hot 03 has advanced to 12P after overtaking Noga 77. Zago 22 is now in 9th place after overtaking Gary Z. The excitement continues as Surianbot and White duke it out for 16th place. Meanwhile, Amit San has made a move up to 18th place by overtaking Edelbrook. Sputnik NZ and Newcombocken are leading the race, with Kamikaze 38 in 3rd place. It's going to be a thrilling race ahead. RC Terra Firma secures the 12th position, overtaking Hot 03. The Lamborghini Jarama S and BMW M1 are in hot pursuit for 12th place. Meanwhile, Edelbrook and V4L3NA are fiercely contesting the 19th spot with their Porsche 911 RS 2.773 and Ferrari Dino 246 GT. Jassax 72 has made a strong move up to 7P, overtaking Zago 22. Zago 22 responds by overtaking Gary Z and securing 8P. Gary Z follows suit and passes Twix 560 from Team Bolt Bucket Motorsports, taking 9p. Twix 560 from Team Bolt Bucket Motorsports is facing difficulty, dropping 10 positions to 22p. Hot Wheels Skid 01 has made an impressive move up to 3p, overtaking Kamikaze 38. They're locked in a tight battle for the third position. Hot Wheels Skid 01 is in a Ford Mustang Mach 171, while Kamikaze 38 is driving a Lamborghini Jurama S. Looks like someone's going for the record in pit stops. Good luck with that strategy, Twix 560. Deplorableeple is now in 4th place, passing Hot Wheels Skid 01. Zago 22 has taken the 7th spot from Jasak 72. Rizaldi Adhar has moved up to 13th, overtaking Hot 03. Hey there Jitwichgrain 795, welcome back to the stream. Great to have you joining us again. Let's enjoy some awesome race car action together. Racing car checkered flag. I'm loving the vintage feel of these street cars. It's like we've taken a trip back in time to the golden age of racing. So much nostalgia and excitement all in one race. The gap between McRae and Obelixamax is down to 42.9. Newcambakken has taken the 2nd spot from Kamikaze 38. Popyoses and RC Terra Firma are scrapping for 10th place. Noga 77 overtakes Popyoses, moving up to 11p. Rizaldi Adhar is closing in on Popyoses, reducing the gap by 2.7. Twix 560 is closing in on Amy, reducing the gap by 3.9. Newcambakken is steadily closing in on Sputnik NZ, reducing the gap by 3.6. A heated battle for 12p between Popyoses in a Chevrolet Impala SS67 and Rizaldi Adhar in a Lamborghini Jurama S. Meanwhile, Hot 03 is making gains on WAC, closing the gap by 3.2. Meyer is narrowing the gap to V4L3NA by 5.8 units. Kamikaze 38 is gaining on Newcambakken, closing the gap by 3.4. Rizaldi Adhar has advanced to 12p, overtaking Popyoses. NB Racing is now in 18th place, overtaking V4L3NA. Following closely, V4L3NA has climbed to 19th, surpassing Meyer. Meyer has advanced to 20th, overtaking Amin San. Kamikaze 38 is inching closer to Newcambakken, reducing the gap by 3.9 seconds. Super Lacroix has made a move up to 21p, overtaking Ricky 095, who has now moved up to 22p, passing Amin San. RC Terra Firma is closing in on Jasak 72, reducing the gap by 2.5 seconds. There's a heated battle for the 13th position between Popyoses and WAC. Additionally, Meyer is narrowing the gap to V4L3NA by 2.5 seconds. Noted. Jasak 72 is narrowing the gap to Zago 22 by 2.6. Rizaldi Adhar is closing in on Moga 77, reducing the gap by 2.2. Lastly, Twix 560 is making gains on Ricky 095, closing the gap by 3.2. Jasak 72 and Zago 22 are in a close fight for 7p. RC Terra Firma is narrowing the gap to Zago 22 by 4.6. Super Lacroix is closing in on Meyer, reducing the gap by 2.4. Kamikaze 38 has surged into second place, successfully passing Newcambacken. Amy is making gains on Twix 560, reducing the gap by 2.1 seconds. Nolga 77 overtakes Gary Z, moving up to 10p. Sarayan Bot closes the gap by 2.1, reeling in Hope to 03. Amy advances to 23p, overtaking Amin San. Kamikaze 38 is making gains on Sputnik NZ, reducing the gap by 2.6. Hope to 03 is also closing in on Poppy Aces, narrowing the gap by 2.7. Obelix Marks has made a move up to 25p, overtaking Twix 560. Hope to 03 is making gains on Popyasis, closing the gap by 3.1. Amin San is narrowing in on Amy, reducing the gap by 3.6. Edelberg is making an impressive push, closing in on Sarayan Bot from Team Death Robots. Meanwhile, NB Racing and V4L3NA are locked in a tight battle for the 18th position with a BMW M1 and a Ferrari Dino 246 GT, respectively. McRae Alive is making a strong move, narrowing the gap to Twix 560 by 47.6. And it looks like Kamikaze 38 is gaining ground on Sputnik NZ, reducing the gap by 2.7. Oh, and McRae Alive is at it again, closing in on Twix 560 by 47.6. Grasheriza said, "Hey Amy, can you give a shout out to Nolga77 for giving me a gift sub? Shout out to Nolga77 for gifting a sub. You're the real MVP." Hey there, Grasheriza. Welcome back to the racetrack. It's great to have you back in the driver's seat with us. Let's rev up those engines and enjoy the ride together. Racing car checkered flag. Twix 560 from Bolt Bucket Motorsports is putting the pressure on Obelix Marks, narrowing the gap by 6.2. Newcambacken has made a strong move to take second place from Kamikaze 38. Meanwhile, Deplorably Bull from Team COD is closing in on Kamikaze 38, reducing the gap by 3.8. Jasax 72 and Zago 22 are neck and neck in the fight for 7th place. Nolga 77 and Gary Z are battling it out for 10th place. Resulti Adhar is closing in on Gary Z from Team No Name Racing, reducing the gap by 2.1 seconds. White is successfully closing in on Resulti Adhar, reducing the gap by 5.2 seconds. Newcambacken is steadily catching up to Sputnik NZ, closing the gap by 3.1 seconds. RC Terra Firma has made a strong move, now in 8th place after overtaking Zago 22. Kamikaze 38 is making gains on Newcambacken, reducing the gap by 2.5 units. Resulti Adhar advanced to 11p, overtaking Gary Z. Popyasis is closing in on White, reducing the gap by 2.4 units. Deplorably Bull is making gains on Kamikaze 38, reducing the gap by 5.4 seconds. Edelberg has advanced to 16p, overtaking Sarayan Bot. NB Racing has narrowed the distance to Sarayan Bot by 3.2 units. Resulti Adhar and Gary Z are locked in a tight battle for the 11th position. NB Racing is gaining ground on Surayan Bot, reducing the gap by 3.0. JASAX 72 and RC Terra Firma are battling it out for 7th place, with JASAX 72 in a Ford Falcon XB GT72 and RC Terra Firma in a Lamborghini Jurama S. Meanwhile, Gary Z has advanced to 11th place, overtaking Resulti Adhar, and is now in a duel for that position. Twix 560 is making a strong move, closing in on Amy by 10.6. Kamikars 38 is also gaining ground on Nikembakum, reducing the gap by 4.2. Meanwhile, Noga 77 is steadily catching up to Zago 22, closing the gap by 2.2. The ongoing battle between McRave Alive and Twix 560 is heating up, with McRave Alive closing the gap by a whopping 504.5 units. Meanwhile, Popyoses is also making a move on Wipe, reducing the gap by 3.8. Keep your eyes on the action as these racers jockey for position. Nikembakum is closing in on Sputnik NZ, reducing the gap by 5.5 seconds. JASAX 72 is also making a move, narrowing the gap to Hot Wheel Skid 01 by 2.9 seconds. Gary Z and Resulti Adhar are battling it out for the 11th position. NB Racing is slowly catching up to Surayan Bot, reducing the gap by 2.9 seconds. Amy has made a move and is now in 23rd place after overtaking Amin San. Noga 77 is quickly gaining on Zago 22, reducing the gap by 2.8. Popyoses is making ground on Wipe, closing in by 2.0. Twix 560 is closing in on Obelixamarx, reducing the gap by 2.4. Obelixamarx is making significant progress, closing in on Amin San by 48.4. Nikembakum is also narrowing the gap on Sputnik NZ by 4.1. Additionally, Popyoses is gaining ground on Wipe, reducing the gap by 3.6. Nikembakum is closing the gap by 7.2 seconds on Sputnik NZ. Meyer is also narrowing in on B4L3NA, reducing the gap by 4.0 seconds. Exciting developments on the track. JASAX 72 is closing in on Hot Wheel Skid 01, reducing the gap by 3.0. Hot 03 is reeling in Popyoses, closing the gap by 3.8. Meyer from Team Death Robots is reeling in V4L3NA, closing the gap by 3.2. Kamikars 38 is making a swift move, closing in on Sputnik NZ by 6.8. Twix 560 is also on the charge, trailing Obelixamarx by 5.5. Nikembakum has surged to 1P, overtaking Sputnik NZ. Resulti Adhar is closing in on Gary Z, shrinking the gap by 2.1 seconds. Amin San is also tightening the distance, reducing the gap to Amy by 3.3 seconds. Twix 560 is making a move on Obelixamarx, closing the gap by 4.6 seconds. JASAX 72 is closing in on Hot Wheel Skid 01, reducing the gap by 4.6 seconds. Edobuk is narrowing the distance to Hot 03, reducing the gap by 2.3 seconds. V4L3NA is reeling in NB Racing, closing the gap by 2.5 seconds. Newcambakken and Sputnik NZ are fighting for the top spot with some skillful driving. Meanwhile, Amy is steadily gaining on Ricky 095, reducing the gap by 3.3 seconds. Newcambakken and Sputnik NZ are dueling for the lead, with Newcambakken in a Chevrolet Chevelle SS70 and Sputnik NZ in a Pontiac GTO 69. Meanwhile, Deplorably Full of Team COD is locked in a battle for 4th place with Hot Wheels Skid 01, driving a Lamborghini Jurana S and a Ford Mustang Mach 171 respectively. Kamikaze 38 is making a strong move, closing the gap on Sputnik NZ by 5.4. Meanwhile, RC Terra Firma has advanced to 6P, overtaking Jasax 72. Deplorably Bull is closing in on Kamikaze 38, narrowing the gap by 2.1 seconds. RC Terra Firma has moved up to 5th place, overtaking Jasax 72. Zago 22 has moved up to 8th place, overtaking Milgus 77. Gary Z is now in 10th place after overtaking Rizaldi Adhar. Rizaldi Adhar responded by overtaking Wack, who is now in 12th place, just ahead of Hot Wheels Skid 01. Meyer is making a strong move, closing the gap to Popyases by 54.8. Hugged 03 now in 13P, overtaking Edelberg. Edelberg has moved up to 14P, overtaking Hot Wheels Skid 01. Sputnik NZ is gaining ground on Newcambakken, closing the gap by 2.5. Surianbot from Team Death Robots has advanced to 15P, overtaking Hot Wheels Skid 01. NB Racing is closing in on Hot Wheels Skid 01, reducing the gap by 2.2. Zago 22 from Team Vanguard has made a move up to 7P, overtaking Jasax 72. Rizaldi Adhar has advanced to 10P, overtaking Gary Z. Hot Wheels Skid 01 is closing in on Surianbot, reducing the gap by 2.3. Kamikaze 38 is rapidly closing in on Sputnik NZ from Team for 20, reducing the gap by 7.3. Also, Hot Wheels Skid 01 is making ground on Surianbot, closing the gap by 3.6. Twix 560 is closing in on Obelixamarx, narrowing the gap by 5.5 seconds. Deplorably Bull has surged to 3rd place, passing RC Terra Firma. Meanwhile, RC Terra Firma has also made a move, now in 4th after overtaking Sputnik NZ. Kamikaze 38 is making a swift move, closing in on Newcambakken from Team Death Robots by 5.8. Sputnik NZ is facing a setback, dropping 6 positions to 11P. Meanwhile, Twix 560 is gaining ground on Obelixamarx, reducing the gap by 6.3. Hugged 03 is making a rapid move, closing the gap to Sputnik NZ by 52.1. Impressive. Milgus 77 has charged up to 6P, surpassing Zago 22 from Team Vanguard. The Lamborghini Jurana S and Ford Falcon XB GT72 are locked in an intense battle for the 6th position. Gary Z has moved up to 8P, overtaking Wack. Wack has moved up to 9P, overtaking Sputnik NZ. Sputnik NZ has moved up to 10P, overtaking Jasax 72. Deplorably Bull is on the move, narrowing the gap to Kamikaze 38 by 2.6. Hugged 03 has made a leap to 11P, overtaking Edelberg, who in turn advanced to 12p by passing Zago 22 from Team Vanguard. Deplorably Bull from Team COD is closing the gap on Kamikaze 38 by 2.0. Sputnik NZ has advanced to 9p, overtaking WEC. Edelberg is closing in on Hugt 03, reducing the gap by 3.4. Kamikaze 38 is narrowing the gap on Mukembakken by 5.9. Sputnik NZ is closing in on Gary Z from Team No Name Racing by 7.1. V4L3NA is reducing the distance to Jasak 72 by 5.4. Kamikaze 38 is making significant gains on Mukembakken, reducing the gap by 6.2. Meanwhile, Sputnik NZ is also closing in on Gary Z, narrowing the gap by 6.7. It looks like Kamikaze 38 is really putting the pressure on Mukembakken, continuing to close the gap by 6.2. Popyoses is closing in on WEC, reducing the gap by 11.8. Oberleichsamax is making gains on Amin San, closing the gap by 41.8. RC Terra Firma is narrowing the distance to Deplorably Bull, reducing the gap by 2.5. Hugt 03 is closing in on Sputnik NZ, reducing the gap by 3.9. Edelberg is also catching up to Hugt 03, narrowing the gap by 2.5. Jasak 72 has made a move to 15th place, overtaking NB Racing. Amy from Team Nafgum Kings is under pressure as Amin San is closing the gap by 3.8 seconds. NB Racing and Jasak 72 are currently in a heated battle for the 15th position. NB Racing is behind the wheel of a BMW M1, while Jasak 72 is maneuvering a Ford Falcon XB GT72. Mocha 77 is now in 4th place after overtaking Deplorably Bull. Hot Wheel Skid 01 is making gains on Edelberg, reducing the gap by 2.4. Additionally, V4L3NA is closing in on Popyoses, narrowing the gap by 2.9. Twix 560 is making a big move, closing in on Oberleichsamax by 538.2 units. Gary Z has climbed to 6th place, passing Deplorably Bull. Hot Wheel Skid 01 is also gaining on Edelberg, reducing the gap by 4.3 units. Gary Z is making gains on Rizaldi Adhar, reducing the gap by 2.2 seconds. Sputnik NZ has advanced to 7p, surpassing RC Terra Firma. Jasak 72 is closing in on Surayan Bot, narrowing the gap by 2.2 seconds. Gary Z is now in 5th place after overtaking Sputnik NZ. Sputnik NZ has advanced to 6th place by passing Rizaldi Adhar. Hugt 03 has climbed to 9th place, overtaking Edelberg. Kamikaze 38 is making a strong move, closing the gap to Sputnik NZ by 7.8. Meanwhile, NB Racing is also gaining ground on Deplorably Bull, reducing the gap by 69.8. It's all about these drivers making strategic moves and pushing their cars to the limit. Sputnik NZ is making a serious move, closing in on Mukembakken by 548.0 units. Hugt 03 is really on the move, overtaking for cars to take 6th place. Gary Z is facing some challenges, falling back 6 positions to 14th place. Jasak 72 advances to 12p, passing Sarayan Bot. Deplorably moves up to 14p, overtaking Gary Z. White is catching up to NB Racing, reducing the gap by 3.4. Twix 560 from Team Bolt Bucket Motorsports is making significant gains on Obelix Marks, closing the gap by 6.1 units. A fierce battle for 3p is underway between Kamikaze 38 and RC Terra Firma. Additionally, Haupt 03 and Rizaldi Adhar are locked in a contest for 6p, with Haupt 03 in a BMW M1 and Rizaldi Adhar in a Lamborghini Jurama S. Arya Serial said, "Hey Amy, who has gained the most positions so far?" So far, rebounding from 16p to 4p, RC Terra Firma is making some thrilling progress. Kamikaze 38 is closing the gap on Sputnik NZ by 6.0. Twix 560 is catching up to Obelix Marks, closing the gap by 6.9. Sputnik NZ is reeling in New Kembakum, closing the gap by 4.4. V4L3NA is reeling in Popyoses, closing the gap by 2.5. Jasak 72 is making gains on Logo 77, shrinking the gap by 2.4 seconds. Meanwhile, NB Racing and WAC are locked in a battle for 16th position, with NB Racing in a BMW M1 and WAC in a Ford Falcon XB GT72. Hot Wheels Kid 01 from Team 1 and Midnight Runners is closing in on Rizaldi Adhar, reducing the gap by 2.0. Meanwhile, Edelbrook and Noga 77 are engaged in a battle for the 10th position, with Edelbrook in a Porsche 911 RS 2.773 and Noga 77 in a Lamborghini Jurama S. Elsewhere, V4L3NA is closing the gap on Popyoses by 3.6. Noga 77 makes a push to the 10th position, passing Edelbrook. Meanwhile, Deplorably squeezes into 13th place, overtaking Sarayan Bot. There's an intense battle between Deplorably in a Lamborghini Jurama S and Sarayan Bot in a BMW M1 for the 13th spot. WAC is making some impressive gains as they close in on Sarayan Bot with a 5.8 second reduction in the gap. Amin San is also showing strong performance by narrowing the distance to Super Lacroix by 6.7 seconds. Meanwhile, Sputnik NZ is steadily closing the gap on New Kembakum, reducing it by 4.6 seconds. Kamikaze 38 is pressuring New Kembakum, narrowing the gap by 7.8. Amin San is making gains on Super Lacroix, reducing the gap by 12.1. Sputnik NZ has surged to 1p, overtaking New Kembakum. Kamikaze 38 has made significant gains, closing in on New Kembakum by 4.2. Meanwhile, Hot Wheels Kid 01 is gaining ground on Rizaldi Adhar, narrowing the gap by 3.6. In the middle of the pack, Jasak 72 and Edelbrook are locked in a battle for 11p, with Jasak 72's Ford Falcon XB GT72 challenging Edelbrook's Porsche 911 RS 2.773. RC Terra Firma is making gains on Kamikaze 38, reducing the gap by 4.2. Haupt 03 and Jasak 72 are fighting for the 10th position, with Edelbrook now in 12th after overtaking Deplorably. Amin San from Team Nafcom Kings is quickly reeling in Obelix Marks, closing the gap by 12.2. Twix 560 is quickly reeling in Amin-san, closing the gap by 493.8. Papiases is reeling in NB Racing, closing the gap by 2.2. Kamikaze 38 is putting the pressure on Nukenbakken, narrowing the gap by 2.3. Deplorably has made a move up to 12p, overtaking Vidalberg. Meanwhile, Wipe has advanced to 15p, overtaking Sarayenbot. Twix 560 is narrowing the gap to Amin-san by 52.9. Meanwhile, Jasak 72 has climbed to 10p, passing Hugt 03. There's a tussle between Jasak 72 and Hugt 03 for 10p. Jasak 72 is in a Ford Falcon XB GT72 while Hugt 03 is in a BMW M1. Amin-san is rapidly closing in on Obelix marks, reducing the gap by 5.2. Nukenbakken is narrowing the distance to Sputnik NZ by 2.9. Jasak 72 is making gains on Zago 22, closing the gap by 2.1. Nukenbakken is now just 5.6 seconds behind Sputnik NZ, and Jasak 72 is closing in on Zago 22 with a 5.3 second gap. Additionally, Nukenbakken continues to reel in Sputnik NZ, reducing the gap by 5.6 seconds. Jasak 72 is gaining on Zago 22, narrowing the gap by 5.9. Nukenbakken has taken the lead from Sputnik NZ, making a move to 1p. Nukenbakken and Sputnik NZ are in an intense battle for the top spot. Deplorably falls back to 17p, making way for others. Amy from Team Deck Robots closing in on V4L3NA by 489.0. Kamikaze 38 takes 2p from RC Terra Firma. Meyer is making a rapid move, closing the gap on Deplorably by 514.6. Resultiadhar has advanced to 5p, passing Hot Wheel Skid 01, who in turn climbed to 6p by overtaking Nogus 77. Hot Wheel Skid 01 is closing in on Resultiadhar, reducing the gap by 5.0 seconds. Kamikaze 38 is also making gains, narrowing the distance to Nukenbakken by 2.2 seconds. Exciting developments on the track. Sputnik NZ has dropped back to 17th position, while Ricky 095 is closing in on Amy with a 10.2 gap reduction. Jasak 72 has moved up to 9th place, overtaking Gary Z. Amy is being chased down by Amin-san from Team Nafgun Kings, who's closing the gap by 502.6. Jasak 72 is closing in on Zago 22 from Team Vanguard, reducing the gap by 2.3. Sarayenbot has made a move up to 14p, overtaking NB Racing. V4L3N is making a strong move, reducing the gap to Meyer by 584.3. Meanwhile, Twix 560 is gaining on Obelix marks, narrowing the gap by 6.8. Resultiadhar has made a great overtake, now in 5p after passing Nogus 77. Meyer is catching up to Sputnik NZ, reducing the gap by 599.5 units. Amin-san is gaining on Amy, closing the gap by 10.1 units. Twix 560 is closing in on Obelix marks, reducing the gap by 45.7 units. from Team Death Robots is being closely pursued by Amin San, with the gap closing by 10.4. Meanwhile, Twix 560 from Team Bolt Bucket Motorsports is rapidly catching up to Obelixamarx, reducing the gap by 10.9. Additionally, Kamikaze 38 from Team Wang and Midnight Runners is gaining on Newkenbakum, narrowing the gap by 2.9. Jausax 72 is closing in on Zago 22, reducing the gap by 5.5 seconds. Twix 560 is rapidly catching up to Obelixamarx, closing the gap by 5.8 seconds. Hot Wheels Kid 01 has advanced to 6th place, passing Resulti Adhar. Twix 560 is making a fast move, narrowing the gap to Obelixamarx by 7.5. Meanwhile, Kamikaze 38 is gaining ground on Newkenbakum, closing the gap by 3.0. Also, keep an eye on Jausax 72 and Gary Z, who are in a tight battle for 9p with their Ford Falcon XB GT72 and Lamborghini Jurana S respectively. Sputnik NZ is reeling in Edelberg, closing the gap by 535.9. Amin San is quickly reeling in Amy, closing the gap by 7.9. Twix 560 is quickly reeling in Obelixamarx, closing the gap by 8.9. The race is heating up as Wipe overtakes Hugt 03 for 11th place. Surianbot is making moves, closing in on Hugt 03. And Popyoses secures 14th place after overtaking NB Racing. Sputnik NZ has made a significant gain, closing in on Edelberg by 12.1. Meanwhile, Deplorableeple is narrowing the gap to Meyer by 5.4. Also, Zago 22 has climbed up to 7p after overtaking Hot Wheels Skid 01. Sputnik NZ is rapidly closing in on Edelberg, reducing the gap by 8.2 seconds. Resulti Adhar is also making gains, narrowing the distance to Nolga 77 by 2.5 seconds. Additionally, Jausax 72 has climbed to 8p, overtaking Gary Z. Zago 22 is closing in on Nolga 77, reducing the gap by 5.4. Deplorableeple is also closing in on Meyer, decreasing the gap by 8.0. Resulti Adhar has moved up to 5p, overtaking Nolga 77. Hugt 03 is gaining on Hot Wheels Skid 01, reducing the gap by 17.9. V4L3NA is closing in on Popyoses, reducing the gap by 64.3. Obelixamarx is reducing the gap to Amin San from Team Nafgum Kings by 507.4. Sputnik NZ is closing in on Surianbot, reducing the gap by 50.2. V4L3NA is catching up to Popyoses, narrowing the gap by 5.2. Kamikaze 38 is reeling in Newkenbakum, closing the gap by 2.2. Zago 22 is making a strong move, closing in on Resulti Adhar by 5.7. Meanwhile, Amin San from Team Nafgum Kings is quickly closing the gap on Amy by 532.8. And Obelixamarx is also on the move, narrowing the distance to Amin San by 54.1. Deplorableeple is closing the gap on Meyer by 5.0. Amin San is closing in on Amy by 5.2. Obelixamarx is reeling in Amin San, closing the gap by 5.4. Well, looks like some intense battles are taking place on the track. Keep an eye on those gaps. Kamikaze 38 is making a move, narrowing the distance to Nickenbacken by 3.5. Meanwhile, Meyer and Deplorableeple are battling it out for the 19th position. Meyer's Fiat 8 Supersonic is up against Deplorableeple's Lamborghini Jurano S from Team COD. Noga 77 and Resultiad Har are in a tight battle for 5th place. Gary Z is making moves, closing in on Jasak 72 with a 2.6 second gap reduction. Deplorableeple from Team COD has climbed to 19th place, overtaking Meyer. Hot Wheels Skid 01 is closing in on WEC, reducing the gap by 2.9 seconds. Sputnik NZ has advanced to 13p, overtaking Sarayan Bot. Deplorableeple is closing in on V4L3NA, reducing the gap by 2.4 seconds. V4L3NA is closing in on Populous, reducing the gap by 2.5. Deplorableeple is reeling in V4L3NA, closing the gap by 2.5. Amin San is reeling in Amy from Team Death Robots, closing the gap by 2.3. Kamikaze 38 has reduced the gap to Nickenbacken by 2.1. Zagoat 22 is closing in on Resultiad Har, reducing the gap by 2.0. WAGP is reeling in Gary Z, decreasing the gap by 2.3. Hot Wheels Skid 01 is narrowing the gap to WAGP by 2.5. Twix 560 is closing in on Obelix Marks, reducing the gap by 2.2. Aussie Terra Firma is rapidly gaining ground on Kamikaze 38, reducing the gap by 2.1. Meanwhile, WEC is closing in on Gary Z, narrowing the gap by 2.3. Aussie Terra Firma is making gains on Kamikaze 38, now only 3.5 seconds behind. Jasak 72 and Gary Z are locked in a battle for 8th place, with WAG closing in on Gary Z by 3.0 seconds. Jasak 72 is narrowing the gap to Zago 22 by 2.4 units. Meanwhile, Populous has advanced to 16p, surpassing NB Racing. The Chevrolet Impala SS67 and BMW M1 are locked in a fierce battle for 16p. Kamikaze 38 is narrowing the gap to Nickenbacken by 2.7. Gary Z has advanced to 8p, passing WAGP. WAGP has moved up to 9p, overtaking Jasak 72. Twix 560 is making gains on Obelix Marks, closing the gap by 5.0. Hot Wheels Skid 01 is catching up to Jasak 72, closing the gap by 2.7. Hot 03 is closing in on Hot Wheels Skid 01, reducing the gap by 3.1. Aussie Terra Firma is making moves, closing in on Kamikaze 38 by 4.1. Gary Z has surged to 7th place, overtaking WAG. In turn, WAG moves up to 8, surpassing Zago 22. Hot 03 is closing in on Jasak 72, reducing the gap by 55.6 units. Edelberg is narrowing the distance to Sarayan Bot, closing the gap by 3.6 units. Hot Wheels Skid 01 is making a swift move, closing in on Zago 22 by 50.3. Susanne Greenberg is also rapidly narrowing the gap with Aria Serial by 529.3. Additionally, RC Terra Firma is gaining on Kamikaze 38, reducing the gap by 2.0. Jetsax 72 is closing in on Hot Wheel Skid 01, reducing the gap by 5.7. Popyoses is closing in on Edelberg, reducing the gap by 8.4. Aria Serial is closing in on McGrave Alive, reducing the gap by 11.7. Amin San is closing in on Amy, reducing the gap by 6.6. Nolga 77 and Resultiadhar are battling for 5p position, while Gary Z is narrowing the gap to Resultiadhar by 2.8 seconds. Jetsax 72 is making a strong move, cutting the gap to WAG by 52.3 units. Meanwhile, Hot Wheel Skid 01 is also closing in on Zago 22, reducing the distance by 5.0 units. The battle for positions is getting intense. Gary Z is making a strong move, reducing the gap to Resultiadhar by 7.5. Ricky 095 is also catching up to Meyer, closing the gap by 7.2. It's a tight race out there. Obelixamax is making an impressive move, closing in on Aminsan by 523.6 units. Kamikaze 38 is also picking up speed, closing the gap on Nikembakan by 4.9. Zago 22 from Team Vanguard is not far behind Gary Z from Team No Name Racing, closing the gap by 2.1 units. Meyer, you've got Ricky 095 closing in fast by 56.8. Jetsax 72 is also inching closer to Hot Wheel Skid 01 by 3.1. Meanwhile, Popyoses has made a move up to 15p, overtaking Edelberg. Obelixamax is closing in on Amin San, reducing the gap by 5.5 seconds. Sputnik NZ is narrowing the distance to WAG by 2.4. NB Racing is closing in on Edelberg, reducing the gap by 2.3. Amin San is enjoying a comfortable lead, but Obelixamax is rapidly closing the gap, now just 5.9 seconds behind. They're really pushing each other in this race. Resultiadhar is making gains on Logo 77, reducing the gap by 2.4. Sputnik NZ is closing in on WAG, narrowing the gap by 2.4. NB Racing is closing in on Edelberg, reducing the gap by 2.0. Hugged 03 is swiftly catching up to Sputnik NZ, closing the gap by 6.2. Susanne Greenberg is rapidly closing in on Aria Serial, reducing the gap by 528.9. Gary Z is reeling in Resultiadhar, closing the gap by 2.5. Gary Z is making gains on Resultiadhar, narrowing the gap by 3.9 seconds. Edelberg is also closing in on Popyoses, reducing the gap by 2.8 seconds. V4L3NA has moved up to 17p, overtaking NB Racing. Sarayanbot is making gains on Hugged 03, reducing the gap by 2.6 seconds. Meanwhile, Twix 560 is closing in on Obelixamax, narrowing the gap by 4.0 seconds. WAG and Sputnik NZ are neck and neck in a battle for 11th place. Meanwhile, Twix 560 is making significant progress, closing in on Obelixamax by 3.4 seconds. Suzanne Greenberg is making a strong move, closing in on RU Serial by 7.5. Meanwhile, RC Terra Firma is closing the gap on Kamikaze 38 by 2.3. Wipe and Sputnik NZ are locked in a tight battle for 11p, with Wipe in a Ford Falcon XB GT72 and Sputnik NZ in a Pontiac GTO 69. Suzanne Greenberg is rapidly closing in on Aria Serial, reducing the gap by 7.0. Kamikaze 38 is gaining on Nikembakken from Team Death Robots, narrowing the gap by 4.8. Sarayanbot is catching up to Hugged 03, closing the gap by 2.4. Noga 77 secures 4p after overtaking RC Terra Firma. Rizaldi Adhar is closing in on RC Terra Firma, reducing the gap by 2.7 seconds. Hot Wheel Skid 01 is narrowing the gap to Zago 22 by 3.0 seconds. Wipe is now just 2.3 seconds behind Hot Wheel Skid 01. Hot 03 is catching up to Sputnik NZ, now only 4.7 seconds behind. Popyoses is closing in on Sarayanbot, narrowing the gap to 2.7 seconds. Noga 77 is rapidly catching up to Kamikaze 38, closing the gap by 14.1 units. Noga 77 continues to narrow the gap to Kamikaze 38 by 14.1. Gary Z has advanced to 6p, overtaking RC Terra Firma. Zago 22 is closing in on RC Terra Firma, reducing the gap by 49.5 units. Rizaldi Adhar has overtaken Kamikaze 38 and moved up to 4p. Exciting developments on the track. Zago 22 is making a strong push, closing in on RC Terra Firma by 5.5 units. Meanwhile, Gary Z has advanced to 5p, surpassing Kamikaze 38. The race is heating up. RC Terra Firma is making a strong move, closing in on Kamikaze 38 from Team Wangan Midnight Runners by 44.9. Rizaldi Adhar has surged to 2p, overtaking Noga 77. The intensity is building as RC Terra Firma continues to close the gap on Kamikaze 38. Gary Z has climbed to the 3rd position, overtaking Kamikaze 38. Kamikaze 38 in turn has moved up to 4th by overtaking Noga 77. Zago 22 is steadily closing in on RC Terra Firma, reducing the gap by 2.7 seconds. Kamikaze 38 is making impressive progress, narrowing the gap to Gary Z by 5.0. Meanwhile, RC Terra Firma has overtaken Noga 77 and now holds the 6th position. Additionally, Zago 22 is closing in on Noga 77, reducing the gap by 2.7. Gary Z is making significant progress, closing the gap on Kamikaze 38 by 15.1 units. Meanwhile, Hot Wheel Skid 01 is also gaining ground on Zago 22, reducing the gap by 6.6 units. Additionally, Kamikaze 38 has overtaken Gary Z, securing the 2nd position. Gary Z is facing a setback, dropping 6 positions to 9th place. Twix 560 is making a strong move, closing in on Obelaxamax by 535.8 units. Noga 77 has surged to 5th place, overtaking Rizaldi Adhar. The pressure's on as Wipe is closing in on Gary Z, reducing the gap by 53.0. Meanwhile, Zago 22 is also making gains, narrowing the distance to Resuldiadhar by 3.8. It's getting intense out there. Obalikesamarks is making a strong move, closing in on Aminsan with a significant 534.7 reduction in the gap. Meanwhile, Wipe is also gaining ground on Gary Z, narrowing the gap by 2.9. It's an intense battle as these drivers jockey for position. RC Terra Firma is making strides, closing in on Kamikaze 38 by 4.3, while Resuldiadhar is also narrowing the gap with Mulgus 77 by 4.0. V4L3NA and Deplorableeple are fiercely contesting the 17th position. V4L3NA in the Ferrari Dino 246 GT is putting up a good fight against Deplorableeple in the Lamborghini Jarama S. Obalikesamarks is making a strong push, closing the gap on Aminsan by 49.2 units. Sarayanbot is also gaining ground on Jasak 72, closing the gap by 2.9. Meanwhile, Deplorableeple has overtaken V4L3N and moved up to 17p. Resuldiadhar is gaining on Mulgus 77, reducing the gap by 2.1. Meanwhile, Hot Wheels Skid 01 is closing in on Zago 22, narrowing the gap by 4.8. Gary Z has narrowed the gap to Hot Wheels Skid 01 of Team Wine and Midnight Runners by 2.5. Edelberg and Deplorableeple are locked in a tight battle for 16p. Edelberg's Porsche 911 RS 2.773 is vying for position against Deplorableeple's Lamborghini Jarama S. As we speak, RC Terra Firma is closing in on Kamikaze 38, shrinking the gap by 4.4 seconds. Jasak 72 is rapidly closing in on Sputnik NZ, reducing the gap by 8.5. The gap between Deplorableeple and Popyoses has narrowed down to 2.3 seconds. Sputnik NZ is under pressure as Sarayanbot from Team Death Robots closes the gap by 2.4 seconds. Resuldiadhar is steadily gaining on Mulgus 77, closing in by 2.2 units. Sarayanbot has made a swift move to 12p, leaving Sputnik NZ behind. Hugged 03 is now in 13p after overtaking Sputnik NZ. Hey everyone, just a heads up that the daily wins have been reset. It's a fresh start for everyone, so get those engines revving and let's see who can come out on top today. Who's ready to dive back into the action and go for those wins? Let's see some high-speed competition out there. RC Terra Firma is now just 4.1 seconds behind Kamikaze 38. Deplorableeple from Team COD has made a move up to 15p, overtaking Popyoses. Meanwhile, NB Racing is closing in on V4L3NA, reducing the gap by 2.5 seconds. Sputnik NZ is closing the gap by 7.5 on Hooked 03. Amy is closing in on Ricky 095 by 526.1. Wipe has overtaken Jasak 72 and moved up to 9p. Sarayanbot has significantly closed the gap on Hot Wheels Skid 01 by 47.5 units. Similarly, Resultiadhar is making gains on Loga 77, reducing the gap by 2.8 units. Sarayanbot is continuing to close in on Hot Wheels Skid 01, now by 47.5 units. Gary Z from Team No Name Racing is closing in on Zago 22, reducing the gap by 6.9. Sputnik NZ is quickly catching up to Hot Wheels Skid 01, closing the gap by 50.3. Super Lacroix is swiftly gaining on Ricky 095, decreasing the gap by 26.7. Amy is catching up to Super Lacroix, reducing the gap by 7.7. RC Terra Firma is closing in on Kamikaze 38, decreasing the gap by 4.7. Resultiadhar is narrowing the gap to Noga 77 by 2.1. Jasax 72 has significantly narrowed the gap to Wike by 2.3. Hot Wheels Skid 01 and Sputnik NZ are fiercely contesting the 12th position. Popyoses is steadily closing in on NB Racing, reducing the gap by 3.1. Gary Z from Team No Name Racing is making moves, closing in on Zago 22 by 2.1. Hot 03 is also reeling on Sputnik NZ, reducing the gap by 2.2. V4L3NA is now closing in on Edelberg, narrowing the gap by 2.0. Kamikaze 38 is making a rapid advance on Newkembakken, reducing the gap by 528.2 units. The competition is heating up as RC Terra Firma is also closing in on Kamikaze 38, narrowing the gap by 3.3 units. Jasax 72 is closing in on Wike, reducing the gap by 3.6. Hot Wheels Skid 01 is catching up to Sarayanbot, closing the gap by 2.8. V4L3NA has advanced to 16p, overtaking NB Racing. As for the current race status, Kamikaze 38 is rapidly gaining on Newkembakken, reducing the gap by 7.2 seconds. Additionally, Popyoses is swiftly closing in on Deplorableeple, shrinking the gap by 9.3 seconds. Notably, Kamikaze 38 continues to close in on Newkembakken, now reducing the gap by 7.2 seconds. Newkembakken is being chased down by Kamikaze 38, who's closed the gap by 6.9. Also, RC Terra Firma is making gains, narrowing the distance to Kamikaze 38 by 2.4. Resultiadhar is closing in on Moga 77, reducing the gap by 2.7 seconds. Jasax 72 is also making a move, narrowing the gap to Wike by 2.9 seconds. RC Terra Firma is rapidly gaining on Kamikaze 38, reducing the gap by 2.6 seconds. Zago 22 is making up ground on Resultiadhar, closing the gap by 2.1 seconds. Popyoses is also narrowing in on NB Racing, reducing the gap by 2.1 seconds. Sarayanbot is making a strong move, closing in on Jasax 72 by 42.5 units. Meanwhile, Kamikaze 38 is narrowing the gap to Newkembakken by 3.3. Noga 77 and Resultiadhar are engaged in a tight battle for the 5th position. Exciting developments on the track. Kamikaze 38 has reduced the gap to Newkembakken by 2.6. Zago 22 is closing in on Resultiadhar, shrinking the gap by 2.8. Edelberg is closing in on Hot 03, narrowing the gap by 3.6. Aminsan has impressively closed the gap by 17.5 on Obelix Marks. Hot 03 is also making gains, closing in on Hot Wheels Skid 01 by 4.9. Popyoses is not far behind, reducing the gap to NB Racing by 4.8. RC Terra Firma is closing in on Kamikaze 38, reducing the gap by 3.2. Sorianbot and Hot Wheels Skid 01 from Team Y and Midnight Runners are in a duel for 12p. Zago 22 from Team Vanguard is closing in on Resuldiadhar, reducing the gap by 5.1 seconds. At the same time, Edelbrook is making gains on Hoped 03, narrowing the gap by 3.0 seconds. Wyke continues to narrow the gap to Gary Z, now down by 5.8. Meanwhile, Sputnik NZ is closing in on Jassax 72, reducing the gap by 4.0. Gary Z is gaining ground on Zago 22, reducing the gap by 3.5. Aminsan is also closing in on Obelix Marks, narrowing the gap by 2.9. Gary Z is gaining on Zago 22, shrinking the gap by 2.2. Hot Wheels Skid 01 is also catching up to Sputnik NZ, reducing the gap by 2.2 for Team Wang and Midnight Runners. Hot 03 is closing in on Sorianbot, reducing the gap by 2.5 seconds. Hot 03 is closing in on Sorianbot from Team Death Robots, reducing the gap by 2.2 seconds. Kamikaze 38 is closing the gap on Mukenboken by 2.3. Zago 22 is closing in on Resuldiadhar, narrowing the gap by 2.9. Jassax 72 is reeling in Wyke, reducing the gap by 3.7. Kamikaze 38 is making gains on Mukenboken, reducing the gap by 3.8. Resuldiadhar has advanced to 5p, passing Mulgus 77. Zago 22 is closing in on Mulgus 77, narrowing the gap by 2.6. Gary Z is making a move, narrowing the gap to Zago 22 by 3.8. Sorianbot from Team Death Robots is also closing in on Hot Wheels Skid 01, decreasing the gap by 2.2. Edelbrook is pushing the pressure on Hot 03, reducing the gap by 4.8. Kamikaze 38 is gaining on Mukenboken, reducing the gap by 5.0. Sputnik NZ is making gains on Jassax 72, closing the gap by 6.1. Hot 03 from Team Navgum Kings is closing in on Sorianbot, reducing the gap by 8.0. Gary Z is making a move, closing in on Mulgus 77 by 5.3. Meanwhile, Deplorableeple is charging after Popyoses, closing the gap by 22.3. And once again, Gary Z is closing in on Mulgus 77, reducing the gap by 5.3. Kamikaze 38 is reducing the gap on Mukenboken by 3.8 units. Hot Wheels Skid 01 has advanced to 11p, overtaking Sorianbot. Sorianbot has moved up to 12p, overtaking Jassax 72. Gary Z is making gains on Mulgus 77, narrowing the gap by 2.1. Sputnik NZ has advanced to 9p, surpassing Wyke. Edelbrook is closing in on Hoped 03, reducing the gap by 2.5. Zago 22 is making a move on Gary Z, reducing the gap by 2.1 seconds. Hot Wheel Skid 01 has climbed to 10p, overtaking WEC. Amin San is closing in on Obelix Marks, narrowing the gap by 2.6 seconds. Amin San is making a strong approach, narrowing the gap to Obelix Marks by 6.3 units. Surayanbot is also gaining ground on WEC, closing in by 3.4 units. Sputnik NZ is closing in on Zago 22, reducing the gap by 2.1. Hot Wheel Skid 01 is also making gains, reducing the gap to Sputnik NZ by 2.9. Amin San from Team Nafgum Kings has advanced to 24p, overtaking Obelix Marks. V4L3N is making up ground on Popiosis, closing the gap by 6.8 units. Twix 560 is gaining on Obelix Marks, closing the gap by 489.6 units. Gary Z is catching up to Noga 77, closing the gap by 2.3 units. Kamikaze 38 is closing in on Nukembakken, reducing the gap by 3.7. Surayanbot from Team Death Robots is catching up to WEC, closing the gap by 2.3. Jasax 72 is narrowing the distance to Surayanbot, closing the gap by 2.1. Deplorably is quickly reeling in NB Racing, closing the gap by 6.6. Kamikaze 38 is reeling in Nukembakken from Team Death Robots, closing the gap by 2.2. Noga 77 has moved up to 5p, overtaking Rizaldi Adhar. Twix 560 is making some serious moves, narrowing the gap to Obelix Marks by 47.7. Meanwhile, RC Terra Firma is closing in on Kamikaze 38, reducing the gap by 4.3. Sputnik NZ is also slowly reeling in Zago 22, closing the gap by 2.1. Twix 560 is steadily closing in on Obelix Marks, reducing the gap by 6.8 seconds. Meanwhile, RC Terra Firma is gaining ground on Kamikaze 38 from Team Wang and Midnight Runners, narrowing the gap by 2.9 seconds. Also, Gary Z is catching up to Rizaldi Adhar, closing the gap by 4.3 seconds. WEC has reduced the gap to Hot Wheel Skid 01 by 3.0. Edelberg is closing in on Hot 03 by 2.3. Popiosis from Team Wang and Midnight Runners is reeling in deplorably, narrowing the gap by 4.8. Hot Wheel Skid 01 is gaining on Sputnik NZ, narrowing the gap by 4.4. Edelberg is closing in on Hot 03, reducing the gap by 2.8. Twix 560 is reeling in Obelix Marks, closing the gap by 3.1. Hot Wheel Skid 01 from Team Wang and Midnight Runners is making a strong push, reducing the gap to Sputnik NZ by 7.5 units. Similarly, RC Terra Firma is closing in on Kamikaze 38, narrowing the gap by 3.0 units. Once again, Hot Wheel Skid 01 is showing impressive progress, reducing the gap to Sputnik NZ by 7.5 units. Edelberg is making a strong push, reducing the gap to Hot 03 by 5.6. Twix 560 is also closing in on Obelix Marks, narrowing the gap by 6.7. Meanwhile, Rizaldi Adhar is gaining ground on Noga 77, cutting the gap by 3.0. Hot Wheels Skid 01 is making an impressive move, closing the gap by 5.5 seconds on Sputnik NZ. V4L3NA is also on the move, reducing the gap by 5.2 seconds on Popyosas. Resultiadhar is gaining ground, narrowing the gap by 2.0 seconds on Locus 77. Kamikaze 38 is gaining on Mukenbakken, reducing the gap by 3.1 seconds. Sarayanbot and Jazak 72 are locked in a battle for 12th place with their BMW M1 and Ford Falcon XB GT 72, respectively. Meanwhile, NB Racing is closing in on Edelberg, narrowing the gap by 2.2 seconds. Hey there, Neib. Welcome back to the stream. We've got some epic race car action today, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Gary Z is making a strong comeback, closing in on Resultiadhar by 5.4. Meanwhile, YKCB is narrowing the gap with Hot Wheels Kid 01 from Team Wang and Midnight Runners by 5.2. Deplorable Apple is also gaining ground, reducing the distance to NB Racing by 7.0. RC Terra Firma is making a strong move, closing the gap on Kamikaze 38 by 7.6. Sputnik NZ is also on the move, narrowing the distance to Zago 22 from Team Vanguard by 9.7. Meanwhile, Hogged 03 is closing in on Sarayanbot, reducing the gap by 6.8. Gary Z is making gains on Resultiadhar, closing the gap by 4.5. Deplorableeple is catching up to NB Racing, reducing the gap by 3.1. Twix 560 is closing in on Obelixamarx, reducing the gap by 4.3. Sputnik NZ is closing in on Zago 22, reducing the gap by 3.3. Edelberg is reeling in Hooked 03, closing the gap by 2.1. Popyosas is reeling in Deplorableeple from Team COD, closing the gap by 3.1. Twix 560 from Team Bolt Bucket Motorsports has advanced to 25p, overtaking Obelixamarx. NB Racing is making a strong move, closing in on Edelberg with a 5.2 second gain. Zago 22 is putting the pressure on Gary Z, closing the gap by 3.3. Hot Wheels Skid 01 is gaining ground on Sputnik NZ from Team for 20, reducing the gap by 2.2. Kamikaze 38 is closing in on Mukenbakken, reducing the gap by 5.0. Zago 22 from Team Vanguard is closing in on Gary Z, reducing the gap by 9.3. Twix 560 is closing in on Amin San, reducing the gap by a significant 538.5. Jazak 72 is closing in on WAC, reducing the gap by 7.4 seconds. Additionally, NB Racing is also catching up to Hooked 03, narrowing the gap by 4.2 seconds. Kamikaze 38 is rapidly catching up to Mukenbakken, reducing the gap by 5.5. V4L3NA is also making significant progress, closing in on Edelberg with a gap of 47.1. Noga 77 has moved up to 4p, passing RC Terra Firma. NB Racing is gaining on Sarayanbot, narrowing the gap by 5.0 seconds. Deplorableeple is gaining on NB Racing, closing the gap by 2.0 seconds. Resultiadhar is now in 5p, overtaking Gary Z from Team No Name Racing. Gary Z has moved up to 6p, overtaking RC Terra Firma. Wipe has moved up to 10p, overtaking Sputnik NZ from Team for 20. Gary Z is gaining on Resultiadhar, reducing the gap by 2.9 seconds. Edelberg has made a move to 17th place, overtaking Popyasses. Zago 22 is making a strong move, closing the gap by 45.4 on RC Terra Firma. Hugged 03 is also on the charge, closing in on Sputnik NZ by 7.1. Notably, Gary Z has made a significant move, overtaking Resultiadhar and moving up to 5p. Popyasses is making a strong push, closing the gap on V4L3NA by 13.0. Super Lacroix is also gaining ground on Ricky 095, reducing the gap by 9.5. Meanwhile, Twix 560 from Team Bolt Bucket Motorsports is rapidly closing in on Amin San from Team Nafgum Kings, decreasing the gap by 540.8. Deplorableeple is making a big move, closing in on Sputnik NZ by 58.8. V4L3NA is also on the move, narrowing the gap with NB Racing by 51.6. Gary Z has moved up to 3p, overtaking Milgus 77. Wild, impressive moves by Wipe, Popyasses, and Twix 560 as they close in on their rivals with significant speed. Gary Z is making a strong move, closing in on Kamikaze 38 by 6.4. Zago 22 is also charging ahead, reducing the gap to Milgus 77 by 9.0. Meanwhile, Deplorableeple from Team COD is closing in on Hot Wheel Skid 01, narrowing the gap by 12.3. Zago 22 is narrowing the gap to Milgus 77 by 7.3. Deplorableeple is closing in on Hot Wheel Skid 01, reducing the gap by 6.9. Gary Z has moved up to 2p, overtaking Kamikaze 38. Kamikaze 38 is rapidly closing in on Gary Z, reducing the gap by 6.6. Meanwhile, Hot Wheel Skid 01 is also gaining ground on Sputnik NZ, narrowing the gap by 3.2. V4L3NA is making a strong move, closing in on Edelberg by 5.3. Meanwhile, RC Terra Firma has surged to third, passing Gary Z. Hugged 03 is also gaining ground on Sir Iron Bolt, closing the gap by 2.8. Deplorableeple is closing in on Hot Wheel Skid 01, reducing the gap by 6.1. V4L3NA is quickly reeling in Edelberg, closing the gap by 6.3. Milgus 77 has moved up to 5p, overtaking Zago 22. Resultiadhar climbing to 7p, passing Gary Z. Sputnik NZ closing in on Jasak 72, reducing the gap by 2.6. Hot Wheel Skid 01 reeling in Sputnik NZ, closing the gap by 3.2. Resultiadhar is making a rapid advance, shortening the distance to Zago 22 by 6.2. Meanwhile, Wipe is also gaining ground on Gary Z, reducing the gap by 6.4. It's an intense battle for position out there. RC Terra Firma has reduced the gap to Kamikaze 38 by 2.6. Gary Z is making moves, closing the gap on Resultiadhar by 3.4.